I think one of the most powerful artifacts and ways to show you how I use blended learning in my class is actually show you my blended learning class in Haiku, which is the learning management system. For instance, this was level 5 in a series of 13 levels for my earth science course. In every level, I kind of start with an idea that they need to be focusing on. So in this one, it was driving question. What would the world be like without minerals? And then I hone in on the focus and the objectives, and then since I'm also a gamified class, I have the earnings upon completion of this level, so they receive a mineralogist badge and a 1 skill point. Before I began this level, I gave each student a study guide. This study guide really focused on all the skills that I wanted them to develop by the end of the level, and they filled that in throughout the level, so that when it came to take the assessment, they had an idea of what I was really expecting them to learn, and they had already filled all of that information in, so they had it towards the end. The mission message was a really powerful way for me to get students to think about the skills that they needed by the end. So this message was more along the lines of, hey, there's this mystery mineral, and you need to figure out what this mineral is. You're going to develop all of these skills, and these are the things you need to figure out. So be looking for that information. So that really got them kind of excited, and they're like, oh, I want to figure out what this mystery mineral is, so I'm going to do really well on all of these activities. The next activity was, what's the difference between a rock and mineral? So they listened to the following audio about rocks and minerals. It was 50 seconds, and they answered the following question when they were done. What's the difference between a rock and a mineral? The next step was U, what things contain minerals? U is the understanding. I want to know what they know. So I had them list at least 5 products that they use on a daily basis that contain minerals. I wanted to see if they could do that. And the next task in that section was get the box of products for me. So I had this cardboard box of products, and I wanted them to write their answers to the following questions that were on their study guide. So I wanted them to identify 10 minerals that were in those products and identify another product where they might find that mineral. The next step was E, so this is the exploratory area. So what is a mineral? I had them watch this video on what a mineral was and fill in their study guide. And then that was kind of the basis. This video was the basis of these next 2 labs. So these were exploratory things. So if they finished the video, they could instantly go and complete lab number 1. Some people would maybe still be watching that video, but that would be fine because it's a blended class. They move self-paced. So then once they were finished, they can move to lab 1. Lab 1 was focusing on what elements are in your mineral. They had to obtain that lab sheet from me in a bag of Legos. They had to look up some vocabulary so they had an idea of how they were going to build this Lego mineral and then kind of dismantle it and figure out what the parts were. And then they were to turn their lab into the basket. Most of my activities, besides these ones that were really paper-oriented, are online, and they would turn those into the Dropbox. After they would finish lab 1, they could move on to lab 2. And lab 2 is, where do you find these minerals? And they had to find this sheet, or get this sheet for me, get a piece of granite and a hand lens, and they're really examining those minerals. So they're doing all of this self-paced, and they just obtain the information from me, or the materials from me as soon as they needed them. The next step in this was mineral formation, so they had another video that they watched. They also connected it to a real-world example with the Crystal Cave article, which is on the cave in Chihuahua, Mexico, the really big selenite crystals. And then they made their own crystal trees with lab number 3. So as soon as they finish that article, they can move on and do lab number 3. Now, I did do lab 3 as a whole class, and you'll see in the instructions it says this lab can only be done as a whole class. And so I had a scheduled date that they had to look on the timeline and say, hey, I can't schedule anything for Wednesday because this is when we're going to do the whole class lab. The next step was they had a mineral identification video. Then they were able to move to the lab where they were actually doing the color, luster, streak, and hardness. They were identifying those minerals. And lastly, these last little bits here, this is kind of wrapping up the whole level, was the mystery mineral. So going back to that mission video, did they accomplish the mission? They had to find out what the mineral's name was, okay, and if there was more than one mineral in that big mineral chunk, they had to identify that. and then what characteristics help them identify the mineral, what is that mineral actually used for, so it's pulling from that other information that we worked on, and then should butte miners, so butte is close to where we live, be interested in this mineral, why or why not? And they submitted that via the Dropbox. The last thing was we had mineral assessment part 1, and then we had part 2. So part 1 was some multiple choice questions on things that were on their study guide. And part 2 was a performance assessment where they actually had to go through the mineral tests and do the color, luster, hardness, streak, and tell me what that mineral's name was. And then lastly, and this is how I always end every single level, because they have to really start thinking about how they're learning and where, like, other questions that they still have. So I always end with a reflection. And in this reflection, it's asking them to do an Earth system science analysis, showing how those minerals interact with the soils and the force spheres on Earth, because we're really looking to try to connect all the information within Earth science and then out into the other spheres and into the other science worlds, like biology and physics. All right, so that's kind of an example of what a blended unit would look like in my class, and I hope that helps.